Welcome to the final episode of In the Shadows of the Holy Land. Today we speak with David Neuhaus SJ, an Israeli Jesuit priest and a leading voice in Jewish-Christian relations in the Holy Land. Raised in the Jewish tradition in South Africa, he later entered the Catholic Church and the Society of Jesus, better known as the Jesuits. With a doctorate in political science, he has taught scripture and theology in Bethlehem and Jerusalem. He has served as the patriarchal vicar for Hebrew-speaking Catholics in Israel and continues to build bridges of understanding among Jews, Christians, and Muslims in hope of peace. Father David Neuhaus, welcome to Common Home TV.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm glad to be with you.
You've spoken in the past, and I'm a great admirer of your journey. It's really amazing to figure out all of those intricate things that make your personhood. And you were born Jewish in South Africa, the German last name, and became Catholic. You're now living as an Israeli citizen. How does this personal journey shape the lens through which you view Gaza and the wider conflict in the region?
I think it's very important to begin with that, Matthew, because we're each coming from a background that frames how we see things and how we formulate things. I mean, basically, everything is a little autobiographical. So the fact that my family were refugees from Nazi Germany, the fact that they found a home in South Africa, the fact that at a very young age, I was just an adolescent, they sent me off to Israel to become a citizen of Israel. And it's there that I encountered Jesus and became a Catholic. All of these elements are certainly very important in how I see things. And if there is something common to the thread that is running through all of that, I would think that I grew up with parents and in an educational system that sensitized me to the margins. And so I think that I'm always tending to look at things from the margins. Of course, I would add that I think that's the Christian way to do things, but because maybe many Christians wouldn't agree with me, I'd again frame it as a consequence of a journey where my family were in the margins in Nazi Germany as Jews. We in South Africa were part of a privileged white minority dominating the country, but I received an education that made me very critical of that. And that then prepared me to arrive in Israel and recognize that now again I was part of an ethnocentric domination that pushed other people to the margins. So I think that, my background certainly is important to understand how I express myself and how I think.
Let's speak about the parallels perhaps in South Africa. What are the limits to those parallels, or what are the parallels that you see when it comes to the system in the occupied territories in Palestine today?
So because you start with the limits, let's say very, very clearly that every situation is unique and every comparison falls short of the whole reality. But I think that the parallels are very, very important. South Africa was famous for a system of apartheid, which means separateness, which means that a certain group have privileges because of an ethnocentric way of thinking. So white people, a small minority in South Africa, ruled for decades over the entire country and had almost unique access to the resources of that country. The system in Israel is not so different. Again, Israel is founded as part of Zionist ideology on ethnocentricity. The state is a Jewish state. So yes, Israel is a state that is a Jewish state, meaning that it's for Jews, and that anyone who is not Jewish is pushed into the margins, referred to generally as non-Jews, right from the beginning, right from the Balfour Declaration. It was the language of Jews and non-Jews, showing this ethnocentricity, and once in the margins there, controlled, pauperized, marginalized, discriminated against, and eventually occupied. And now we've moved into another phase, a phase that tended to dominate in certain periods, and that is a phase of genocide. So, yes, there are many parallels, and being brought up in the South African context, of course, sensitized me immediately to similar power dynamics in the Israeli situation.
Well, it's interesting. You brought up the Balfour Declarations in 1917. I think in the popular imagination, to some of the people I speak with now, someone gave me a throwaway comment the other day when I was on my kid's sporting event. They were like, "Well, it's Israel. You know that place has been just thousands of years of ongoing war and ongoing hatred between Arabs and Jews." But can you tell us? You know, you've spoken before about the 1917 really being like the beginning of something. In 1917, my grandfather was born before that. My grandmother was born before that. That's not a 1,000-year history. But before that, what was in the late 1800s? Or the mid 1800s? What was the relationship between Palestinians and Jews in the region or
So I do not want to paint any idyllic scenes of a glorious past that we need to restore. But what was very, very important to point out is that Palestine, which was for hundreds of years part of the Ottoman Empire, provided a home for a majority of Muslims and two small minorities. There were other minorities as well, but for the sake of argument, we'll stick with two other small minorities of Christians and Jews. And the lingua franca was Arabic. There was a shared sense of an identity defined in those times probably predominantly by living in certain cities or in certain regions. What happened, and this is what changed at the end of the 19th century, is when Jews were pushed out of Europe, experienced growing anti-Semitism, which is a product of the types of nationalism, populist nationalism, that was spreading first through Eastern Europe and then also became predominant in Western Europe, and Jews were made to feel that they didn't belong in Europe. And this led, beginning from the 1880s, to waves of migration of Jews to Palestine. Again, nationalism is based on very potent mythologies, and Jewish nationalism, Zionism, is no exception to that. And so the biblical texts were pumped for a type of mythological discourse that brought to the forefront of some Jewish consciousness that we have a homeland. We came from this historical place. Of course, it's mythological. And what happened then is that waves of Jewish migration, growing ever larger, from the 1880s to the period of the First World War, when the Balfour Declaration was made, and then through the 1920s and 1930s, Nazism is rising in Europe, to post-Second World War, when many millions of Jews have been murdered, and many millions of Jews more have been made homeless in Europe, pushed out of Europe, and some of them finding supposedly their ancestral home in Palestine. Now, the big change was Jews had always thought about Palestine. It's mentioned in the liturgy, Jerusalem. A few Jews had even decided to go and live there. But until the 1880s, and even more strongly after the Balfour Declaration, and then absolutely predominantly after the Second World War, Jews no longer came to Palestine to integrate into the existing population. I mean, first and foremost, when you move to a foreign country, you as a Canadian moved to Australia, you had to learn Australian, right? You had to become part of what Australia is. New Zealand, right? Oh, sorry, I'm making a mistake.
Australia, yeah.
Australia. So you had to become part of what Australia is. Jews who were Zionists began to believe that this country is theirs and the society that they want to create there can absolutely ignore the fact that there is already a society there, an indigenous society composed also of some Jews, but no longer learn the language, no longer respect the culture, and seek to replace it. And here comes the violence which was introduced. And again, 1917, a very important date, because British politicians, being Christian Zionists, meaning, in a certain sense, biblical fundamentalists, also had the idea that this land is a homeland for Jews and Jews should be restored there, of course, in preparation of the coming of Christ. They also recognized the terrible suffering of the Jews in Europe, and so again, another reason to send the Jews off to this homeland, and completely ignored, being colonialists, being imperialists, completely ignored the local population, and so adopted the same vision of the Jews would replace the local population, subdue the local population, or, and already then formulated fully, chase out the local population, expel the local population, displace them to somewhere else. And here, of course, we encounter what I would term as the beginning of a major conflict, not immediately apparent in 1917, but violence begins 1920, 1921, 1929, and then by the late 1930s, many in the British administration realize that they've made a terrible mistake. Of course, by now, hundreds of thousands of Jews are living in Palestine, still a minority of the population, but this migration has been facilitated by the British. And so they start about chopping up the country into different parts, a Jewish state, an Arab state, and that would be eventually the solution adopted by the international community in 1947, which again does not take history seriously. It attempts to impose an artificial solution of cutting up the country and making one part Jewish, one part Arab. Interestingly, until now, we're in 2025, many decades after 1947, when international community decided to make two states. There are still not two states. There's still only the state of Israel that controls the entire territory.
Yeah, can I just pull back to something you were saying? Because I think it's, again, with your unique identity, there's something to be said about the ideas of Israel of the Bible in the context of biblical Judaism, and in Catholicism, as well as in evangelical Protestantism that can sometimes be Christian Zionism. Can you talk about maybe each of them quickly, so our listeners can understand the differences? So my wife is not Catholic. When she comes to Mass with us and the kids, sometimes she'll hear the word Israel and she'll be looking at me like, wait, what's being said here? So maybe a little bit of a breakdown of those three could illuminate a little bit that they're not all the same tradition.
Okay, they are certainly not the same tradition, and they have very specific ways of looking at the Bible. But the whole idea of Jewish homeland, meaning a nation state in the land of Palestine, needs to be recognized as something completely modern. And that modern idea will be imposed on a certain reading of the Bible. So first, let's look at how Jews read the Bible. Jews, until the end of the 19th century, recognized a very, very profound link between the Jewish people and a land from which they had been exiled. And again, this is a religious idea. It's not a nationalist idea. A land from which they had been exiled and which one day, in God's good plan, they would return to. And I think many Jews would have believed that. Very, very few Jews would have thought of migrating physically to Palestine. It was something that was repeated in synagogue liturgy. And what we need to take into account is by the time we reach the end of the 19th century, many, many Jews are alienated from that traditional way of thinking. So many Jews no longer read the Bible, many Jews no longer take religion seriously, and many Jews who do take religion seriously are much more interested in integrating in the societies in which they live than thinking of some imaginary mythological homeland. In fact, it's interesting to point out that there was a Jew in the cabinet of David Lloyd George during the time of the Balfour Declaration. His name was Lord Montagu, and he was absolutely shocked that his colleagues, those British ministers, were thinking of creating a Jewish homeland in Palestine. He said, "What? I have a homeland. I'm British. This is my homeland. So what the hell are you talking about? Is this your own anti-Semitism that you don't want Jews in England?" And he posed very, very piercing questions that are still very relevant. By the way, it's also interesting to note he was Secretary for India. And so he knew what colonialism looked like and was very wary of having the Jewish people become a people of colonialists in Palestine. So I would say that Zionism had a real struggle winning the hearts of Jews, and what made many, many Jews Zionists in the long run was being chased out of Europe, being exterminated in Europe, when there seemed to be no other choice, the first choice having been to integrate, and that door was slammed shut by the Nazis and by other forms of anti-Semitism in Europe. Today, what is interesting is that many Jews are waking up to the fact that the Zionist reading of the Bible is a fundamentalist one. The Jewish reading of the Bible had been mediated by the rabbinic tradition, which made the Jewish tradition focus on other extremely important elements of identity that did not include land or estate or any kind of kingdom in Palestine. And so many Jews today are becoming aware of the perversion of Jewish history and Jewish tradition that has been worked by the Zionist movement.
And then in the Catholic tradition, how is Israel then in the
Right.
readings?
So I would say that not
liturgy
only,
as well.
yeah, not only the Catholic tradition, but the traditional Christian tradition, meaning Catholic, Orthodox, the churches of the East, the mainstream Protestant churches, they understand that this is a very, very significant part of what prepared for the coming of Jesus, meaning the choice of a people out of which Jesus came, and that people had a land called the land of Israel, and all of this prepared for the coming of Jesus. But when Jesus came, fulfilling all that was promised, Jesus opened up the promise to the nations. And this is a very significant part of our Christian faith, that on the cross, Jesus destroyed all of the boundaries, all of the walls that separated one person from another. I'm not saying that we always lived that very well. And any Jew listening to me would say, ha, 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 nice theory. But you Christians put up lots of borders. But again, we're talking about the tradition and what the tradition preached, and what we have come certainly in modern times to recognize, and that is Christianity is a universal religion and cannot sacralize borders, cannot sacralize one people over another people. And so the reading of the Bible that certainly takes into account the chosenness of a people, the sacred borders of a land, sees it all as preparation for Jesus, and that Jesus, fulfilling all of that, transformed the land into the face of the earth and transformed the chosen people into a people composed of many nations, the church. And so again, I think that the traditional Christian traditions would have a lot of problem with justifying types of Zionism that want to hang on to nation state and borders from a theological point of view. Okay, now we come to the third group that you mentioned, the Christian evangelicals. And here we have a number of problems. Again, a complex history coming out of 16th century, 17th century England, and ideas that go back to a kind of crude, untraditional way of reading the Bible. The Bible speaks for itself. It does not need tradition. And then reading into the Bible a need for restoration, that in order for Jesus to come again, the Jews must be restored to their land. And this is not necessarily out of a great love for the Jewish people, because the focus will then become on, once they are restored to the land, Christ will come, and in preparation for that coming, all of those who do not believe in Christ, will be destroyed, and the Christians will be the triumphant people of God. A kind of reading which again is perverse, because there is so much violence in it, and an image of God that is a warrior God. And again, after the 1967 war, the attempt to read the Bible as a kind of description of modern politics, which would be very foreign both to the true Jewish tradition and, of course, also to any kind of traditional Christian tradition.
We think about this, and we think about fear and safety, and you're speaking your own context of being driven out by Nazis and looking for safety. Do you see the modern state of Israel being able to provide safety, or is it an illusion of safety, not just due to displacing internal population or genocide within internal population, but being surrounded? Do you think that there is a
So
possibility?
this is the horrific awakening that I think many, many, many people went through after what happened on the 7th of October 2023. Of course, there were Jews in the margins who were aware of this always, who said that taking the Jewish people and making the focus of their survival a state based upon discrimination and occupation, repressing another people, is certainly not a recipe for safety, but a recipe for ongoing war. But this became something very, very powerful when you had on the 7th of October 2023, thousands of Palestinians streaming into the state of Israel and being able to wreak havoc, murder, destroy. It suddenly became a scenario that Jews could imagine. And I'm not sure that many Jews have picked up on this and said, oh my God, we are stuck in something that we need to get out of, which is the illusion of a nation state in the midst of a hostile Middle East, built upon the ruins, the devastation of Palestinian society. Let's get out of this. I think that many have been brainwashed into thinking that by the use of force, by the fact that Israel has become such a military power, and the most disastrous of all, supported unconditionally by the United States of America, we can destroy our enemies. But I think that the question that you're raising is a question that is hovering over many, many Jews today. Is Zionism really a recipe for our security, or is it a recipe for further disaster? And again, because I was sensitized to this, I've been living in Israel since 1977. Because I was sensitized to this, I immediately picked up on the themes of discrimination within the state of Israel and the occupation of territories that Israel has ruled militarily since 1967, saying, here is a recipe for disaster. This cannot continue in its present form. And I think that there are Jews more and more on the margins who are waking up to this reality of, no, we are not safe, we are not secure. This is the last thing that we needed, coming out of the Holocaust, to go into this experiment in trying to repress and now wipe out another people so that we can exist in its place.
When you speak on Gaza, different audiences, Jewish, Christian, Israeli, Palestinian, receive your words, because it's again your personal story is such, and we shouldn't lose sight, as you said before, of the uniqueness of everybody's personal journey and how they then have the lens of their own identity and dignity. But you have a very unique understanding, having Jewish, Catholic, South African. How does that play to your audiences? Is there hostility between some? Is it more accepting? Does it open doors? Does it close doors?
Look, unfortunately, what you want to see in my background as possibly opening up audiences, because I can speak Hebrew to Jews and I can speak Arabic to Arabs and I can speak foreign languages to foreigners, it does not necessarily mean that people will open up. I think it's more in how we try to present what's going on. And that is the attempt always to speak truth, to be able to listen to fear and to try and respond to that fear that might open up people who are not open to the perspective that I or Samuel Youssef, who you'll speak to next, I think that we are pretty much on the same page on most issues. And I think that we would have pretty much the same problems with, for example, Jews who are still absolutely convinced that Zionism is the recipe for Jewish safety. This would be an audience that would not be open to me, that would see me as, in traditional Jewish terms, a mushumad, somebody who's destroyed their soul by converting to another religion. They would accuse me of being an anti-Semite, although, of course, I see myself as someone deeply, deeply committed to the Jewish people and to the survival of the Jewish people, but see that the way that we've chosen since 1917, since 1948, since 1967 is the wrong way. Another group that would not be open would be Palestinians who see the Jews as foreign colonialists who must be exterminated. And there is a group of Palestinians who think like that, sometimes animated by radical Islamicist or Marxist ideology. Again, would they be open to dialoguing with a Jew, any Jew? I'm not sure. But I think that when we speak together, and again, there are a convinced number of Israelis and a convinced number of Palestinians who can speak with one voice. And that voice speaks in the name of three values that I think need to be stressed. The first one is equality, that all people are equal. As Catholics, as Christians, as religious people, we would say that this value is based upon the fact that God is a parent God to all of us, and that we are all, whatever our color, our gender, our political or other orientations, we're all created in the image of God. Equality becomes a religious value. The second is justice, that we cannot shy away from justice, and here a massive injustice has been done. Those well-meaning Protestant fundamentalists who wrote the Balfour Declaration and voted on it, and those myriads of Christians who now support the state of Israel because they see it somehow in biblical texts, must recognize that an incredible injustice has been done to a people that was never consulted, a people that was pushed out of the picture, a people that has since been marginalized, pauperized, discriminated against and occupied, and is now facing a genocide. So justice is an absolutely essential part of the picture. And the third value is peace. How are we going to get there? How are we going to get to a situation where Jews and Arabs can be reconciled? Now, with your permission, Matthew, I want to go back to something you said when you depicted the Middle East as having always been a place of warfare. This has been going on for thousands of years. It's not true. I wouldn't say that it's always been an idyllic place of peace and coexistence, but what is so interesting to remember is that Jews predominantly had a hard time in Christian environments. Not always and not everywhere, but Christians came up with this accusation that the Jews had killed God, that the Jews were a treacherous people, that the Jews were trying to take over, and that the Jews needed to be wiped out. Jews coming from that environment often found refuge in Muslim countries. And that's not to say that Islam has not known times of persecution and discrimination against the peoples who live within Muslim environments. But it's undeniable that when the Jews were pushed out of Spain and Portugal, they found refuge in the Ottoman Empire. And when Jews were pushed out of Europe, very often they found homes in the Arab world. In 1948, there were 1 million Arabic-speaking Jews who were part and parcel of the Arab countries in which they lived, and together with Christians and Muslims were working for an open society. I don't say that that open society was ever realized, but I think we tend to forget that there have been periods of time where Jews and Arabs have lived together in coexistence. They have been able to build together an incredible civilization, which is the civilization that we call the Arabic civilization, and that Arabic was a home for Jews, Arab lands, Arabic language, and Arabic civilization. Again, it's lost. I'm not saying that we can recreate it, but I think we do need to know history in order to work for a better future, because often we're kind of prisoners of a present, and the animosities of the present seem to be inescapable.
We'd be remiss if we didn't speak about anti-Semitism in the current situation. Can you speak a little bit to that horrible, age? Not something of the now. This is not anti-Semitism. Clearly, isn't anything new, but how it is being spoken about, the rise of it within this debate contextually.
But I think that we need to say two things, and two things very, very clearly. The first thing is that anti-Semitism is a reality, unfortunately. It's a reality that has had horrific consequences for the Jewish people, and it hasn't disappeared. I'd like to tell you a story that illustrates this. A few years ago, I was invited to a Jesuit university in the United States to teach a course on the Israel-Palestine conflict. And sitting one evening with a group of Jesuits, all very educated people, I spoke about the conflict. Most of the people at the table did not know my background, so they did not know that I am Jewish, and not only Jewish, but of German Jewish origin. And as I was speaking, they listened attentively, and when I finished, one of the older Jesuits said, "Oh, it's terrible what those Jews are doing to the Palestinians." And I was a little surprised because I had not used the word Jews. I was very careful always to use the word Israeli government, Israeli army, not singling out, not even Israelis, but certainly not Jews. And then he added something that took my breath away. He said, "But you know what really gets me? The stories those Jews tell about the Germans. Nothing happened during the Second World War. The Germans are a wonderful people." And I suddenly realized, it was almost instantaneous, that my criticism of the state of Israel and the actions of the Israeli military had opened up in this man's head the impression that I, like him, was an anti-Semite, hated Jews. And he had used my criticism of what Israel does to justify his own horrific anti-Semitism. So I simply stood up at the table and I said, "You know, Father, what you're saying is very interesting. Maybe you'll tell me one day what really happened to all of my relatives who perished in the death camps of the Nazis." And I walked away from the table. I lived in community with that man for 9 months, and he was never able to look at me. And I realized I had betrayed him. I had given him the impression that I was like him by criticizing Israel and the Israeli army. So anti-Semitism is real. But, and here is the huge but, for decades, Zionism has weaponized anti-Semitism to silence any critique of the Israeli state, the Israeli government, the Israeli army's actions and policies with regard to the Palestinians. And this is devastating, that this real suffering of my people is used in order to silence any discussion of the real suffering of the Palestinian people. This is the weaponization of anti-Semitism in current discourse. And I would say that even the attempts by some to define anti-Semitism in order to name it has fallen into this pit, this trap of linking criticism of Israel in any way to the horror of anti-Semitism, which is the hatred and discrimination against Jews. So the discussion is very volatile. And again, we can see this when, for example, the huge demonstrations in the universities in the United States took place. And immediately, Zionists began to define those demonstrations as anti-Semitic. Now, what's going on is very complicated. So many Jews have been brainwashed into thinking that Israel and whatever Israel does is Jewish. So that saying things like free Palestine or stop the genocide become in their minds linked to they hate me because I'm a Jew. So to unpack this, to untangle this incredibly complex mess has to be done with firmness, but with also a sensitivity.
Many Catholic leaders in the West, particularly, both lay and clerical, have had a hard time criticizing or have been very hesitant to criticize Israel. What do you wish they would see from your perspective?
There are two types of leaders. One type that really does not see because they just don't want to look. And I'll explain why I think they don't want to look. And then others who do see, but are too scared to say anything. They are fearful of saying what they see. And I think the motivations of both are the same. So I would say that there are three basic motivations, and I think they somehow merge together, and maybe there are others as well. But from what my understanding is, number one, Bible, how we read the Bible. It has become so fundamentalist, even in Catholic circles. You know, we celebrated Vatican II, 60 years since the end of Vatican II and the return to the biblical text. And it is wonderful. I teach the Bible. I love the Bible. But the Bible is not a simple book to read. And the terms Israel, promised people, promised land, election, all of these terms need very sophisticated hermeneutical processes so that we don't fall into a type of fundamentalism that gets people to think that, yeah, God gave Israel to the Jews today. And the Philistines, oh, did I say Philistines? Perhaps we should say Palestinians, really don't have a place there. So there's a type of biblical fundamentalism, which I think that many Catholics would immediately pick up when they're conscious of it, but still influences their way of thinking about what's going on in the Middle East. That's number one. Number two, a deep, deep-seated feeling of guilt about what happened to the Jews in Europe. And again, I don't want to say that has no reasons. It has very good reasons. But guilt is not productive. It's not fruitful. Taking responsibility, engage in actions to repair broken relationships, that's excellent. But I think there too, on an unconscious level, many people feel uncomfortable of criticizing Jews because our discourse, our contempt for Jews and Judaism was so rampant in past generations. Thank God we've become aware of it. And now we have a problem speaking out a criticism against anyone who's Jewish or the Jewish people in general without thinking immediately, maybe I'm continuing that teaching of contempt. So that's a second element. There's a third element. And this I feel very strongly about after having spent 5 years living in Europe, first in France and then in Italy. And that is a lingering racism in so much of our Christian people, Catholic and non-Catholic, a racism that comes out often when we talk about Muslims, a sense of superiority at best, but then also a sense of feeling under siege. They're taking over, they're aggressive, they're evil, the stereotypes about Islam have in some sense replaced the stereotypes we used to spread about Jews. So again, I think that there are these three elements. A lot of it is unconscious, but it's there in a lot of Christian leadership. One, Bible. Two, what we've done to the Jews and the guilt we feel. Three, a kind of Islamophobic racism that often frames the way that we see or think about what's going on in the Middle East.
Well, I guess that leads into a good question about your discussion about prophetic discourse. And how do you feel that your personal background and your identity obliges you to speak directly on Gaza, even though it might be uncomfortable? And what does that mean for the church to be prophetic in the face of war?
Well, I do not know if I'm a prophet or not. I think that we are all called to be prophetic. And what does it mean to be prophetic? I'm very much influenced here by the writings of an exceptional commentator on the Bible who passed away recently in his 90s. He was a Protestant from the United States of America, Walter Brueggemann, who in the 1960s wrote one of the real great texts of biblical theology called The Prophetic Imagination. And in that book, he lays out, I think, what is the vocation of every Christian, and not only Christians as individuals, but the church as an institution must play a prophetic role. So what does that mean? First of all, it means recognizing the crisis. Prophets are only needed in a time of crisis. And it means being able to look clearly at what's going on. Can we look clearly at what's going on without being distracted, without being torn by all of our neuroses, our biblical, Jewish, Muslim neuroses? Can we look at what is going on in Gaza right now and describe it? And again, we have the help of these wonderful organizations, including incredible Israeli organizations that are describing exactly what's going on. And here, Israelis and Palestinians and the international community have come to a description of what needs to be termed genocide. The Palestinians are being wiped out. After years and years of repression and control, a new reality has dawned, genocide, which, by the way, has roots in what happened in 1948. Can we look at that and identify it as crisis? The prophet steps into a situation of crisis. Okay? The next thing is, the prophet is able within that situation to see the alternatives. Because part of what we are told by so many of our political leaders is, this is reality. We just need to look at it, accept it, swallow it. It's always been like this. It is like this now. It needs to be like this. It will always be like this. These are the lies that make crisis a permanent status quo. And I think that the prophet is able to see, no, this does not need to be like this. And again, as I mentioned earlier, I think that we need to be helped by building a hope based upon looking backwards. We think of hope as forward-looking, but hope is not always forward-looking. Sometimes in a situation where the future is completely walled off, hope can be an illusion. It can be an absurdity. It can be a neurosis if that hope is in front of a wall. And then we have to look back and say, from our knowledge of history, from our knowledge of our story, there have been moments which are very different from the present. And from that understanding of the past, we can build a bridge to a different future. And of course, the prophet needs to be courageous, because the prophet is speaking truth to power. And power has many ways to crush the prophetic voice. Now, in this, I'm very privileged because I'm an Israeli. People inside Israel who would speak out like me, if they were Palestinian, would be eliminated. Okay? As we've seen, are physically exterminated when it comes to the journalists and the number of journalists that have been killed in Gaza. Okay? If they are Palestinians elsewhere, they could be imprisoned, they could be exiled. As an Israeli, I'm very privileged that I can speak from within a system that hopefully will always recognize that I am an Israeli. So again, I'm not sure that I'm a prophet, but I think that there is a clarity about what the prophetic voice needs to act on, speak out and act right now in the face of the genocide in Gaza.
Do you feel it's a burden, the legacy of your Jewish family being killed in the Holocaust? And then also, does that give you more of an impetus to push and speak out of the currently what's happening in Gaza? Is there a historical lens that you see, or not historical, through your own identity?
Oh, I mean, of course, it's a tragedy. It's a terrible tragedy what happened to my people. It's a terrible tragedy what's happening to the Palestinian people. I see my context as an incredible privilege and a gift. I see my context as opening me in ways that would have been almost unimaginable if I didn't come out of that context. So, if I had not been born into a family of Holocaust survivors with an incredible awareness of what happened to the Jews in Germany, if I had not been born into the South African context where the suffering of the Black people could have been ignored, but I had wonderful parents who were absolutely aware of it. I went to a wonderful Jewish traditional school where teachers spoke with us about it and said, do not pass by, look at it, do whatever you can to bring the situation to an end. And then moving to Israel at a very, very young age, coming from that background and being welcomed into a Palestinian family. We haven't mentioned that yet, but I speak fluent Arabic, and that is because I was adopted into a Palestinian Muslim family. And starting to talk about where they were coming from, what they saw, traveling around the country with my brother, who is my best friend, and him showing me what was underneath the Israeli veneer, a Palestine that had been destroyed in 1948, a Palestine that had been occupied in 1967. I think all of these gifts are exactly that, a privilege and a gift, not a burden at all.
You were speaking about how you were raised into this Jewish community of education. And I think that would be great for our listeners to understand the Jewish and Catholic faith traditions of justice, both how they give you an interpretation for something like Gaza, but in justice and peace, and what both faiths, either their similarities, contrasts when they speak of peace in a faith tradition.
So I think that here again we need to celebrate the recognition now after 60 years, Nostra Aetate, the document that really changed the relationship between Jews and Catholics, that we can now look at what we have in common and not focus on what we have that makes us different. And I think that here again, reading the Bible together, Jews and Catholics, we can come to an understanding of those elements in our biblical tradition and then developed differently and separately in the traditions that devolved from the Bible, can lead us to a place where we can come together to collaborate in order to repair this broken world, because we live in a world that is broken. And I think that biblical language is an enormous aid if it's used correctly. Again, the Bible can be perverted. We've spoken about that, how it's been used and abused to persecute Jews, to wipe out Palestinians, all of it, to impose the apartheid regime. The people who were applying the apartheid regime were religious and Bible readers and using the Bible to do horrors. We use the Bible to oppress women. We use the Bible to oppress all kinds of groups. So again, it's a careful reading, and I would say a reading in community, a reading that makes me aware that whatever text I might be reading can also be harmful. And I want to open it up a little. I just mentioned that I was adopted into a Muslim family. And one of the first things that my brother suggested to me was, in order to improve your Arabic, let's read the Quran together. And so started years and years and years of my reading the Quran together with Muslims and in friendship, so that we would read texts that would blow my mind in terms of their poetry, the beauty of the language. They would open up vistas in terms of my own understanding of the Bible that I would never have received had I not been in dialogue with Muslims. But of course, there were also times when a Muslim would say to me, this is what the text means. And I say, Usama, Yahya, Nufuz, whoever I'm reading with, but that excludes, that discriminates, that is violent. And of course, that being done to me when I read my Bible texts with women who say, how can you read those texts? We should burn those texts, not read them. Or with LGBT, or with Black people, or with Palestinians, saying these are violent texts. So again, the Bible is an incredible treasure in my life and hopefully in the life of the church. But I think after all these centuries of reading it, using it and abusing it, we must be much more aware today that reading it alone is not an option. I must read it within a community. And that community now must be open to the people that in the past I've mistreated, abused, discriminated against, marginalized, thinking that this was the will of God and recognizing that it cannot possibly be the will of God. The Bible must be good news for everyone.
Well, what's happened now, as you've named genocide, what prospects give you any hope? As you said, things have clearly taken a change. What could be a source of light going forward?
It's not an easy question to answer, and I certainly would not want to use any kind of answer to escape the darkness that we need to be in and pass through.
Mm-hmm.
So hope can easily also become an illusion, an absurdity, an opium. And we must be very careful of that. So what are the two sources of hope that I kind of cling to so that I do not become completely despairing and paralyzed by despair? And one is my religious faith. I do believe that there is a God who is a creator of heaven and earth and a savior, a redeemer. I believe that. I believe that right now what I'm doing is I'm screaming out my rage, my despair, my pain to that God, saying, where are you? And recognizing that in the biblical narrative, in the biblical text, there are those that shouted out that pain. In other words, it's absolutely permissible, not only permissible, it's necessary. It's necessary to lament and to rage and to call God to account. Abraham did, Habakkuk did, even Jesus on the cross calls out that sense of despair. And that is certainly a very big part of my relationship with God right now. But God and my belief in God is certainly also a tiny, tiny light on the horizon. The other light on the horizon is the people who break through and courageously confront what is going on. And right now, the recognition that the Jewish voices that are calling Free Palestine at the Emmys 2 nights ago, a Jewish actress ended with that call. And I thought, wow, I'm particularly inspired by those writing and producing. I'll mention a name of an Israeli who I've never met, never conducted a dialogue with, but see his work, Yuval Avraham, a young Israeli coming from a regular Israeli background, nothing special, who suddenly woke up and has become one of the very important activists in trying to lead Israelis to some kind of awareness of what their society is built on. No Other Land is the film that he worked on together with Basil Adra, a Palestinian from villages south of Hebron that are in the process of being destroyed. So seeing people who, despite everything, break through. Now, I'm particularly influenced again by my South African background. At the end of the 1980s, there was no hope in South Africa. Things were at their most violent and their darkest. By the mid-1990s, the South African scene was dominated by someone who strode out of prison and was a beacon of light. After 27 years of being locked up, this man came out with a vision of a South Africa that was a South Africa for everyone. I'm talking, of course, of Nelson Mandela. So the human spirit, in some cases, is also a source of great hope. Our God and the human spirit that can prevail, that can speak truth to justice, that can endure incredible suffering and yet speak out. So Israelis, Palestinians, Gentiles, Christians who saved Jews during the Holocaust, white activists in South Africa, and black people who came out of that horrific experience of apartheid with hearts that could embrace also white people. This gives me hope because it's part and parcel of our human reality. Unfortunately, right now, the darkness is real, profound darkness. But these are lights that are glimmering out there on the horizon.
Well, I'd like to take this time to thank you for speaking with us. I often, in a lot of our podcasts, we try to end on a high note, but I think it is worth us ending on the sober cone of darkness. And I hope to speak with you as soon as possible in the radiance of a light. So I guess we'll both hold that hope in solidarity together. So on behalf of everyone at Common Home TV, the Redemptorists around the world, we thank you for taking the time to engage with us.
Thank you, Matthew. God bless you.